Thank you very much, Chris, and can I thank ANZSOG and Allan Fels in particular for this opportunity to gather together with fellow members of an oppressed minority, people who are interested in reform. I'm a big fan of Allan and particularly his work at the ACCC, and although it's perhaps slightly off the topic that I'm required to talk to today, I think it is worth noting that Australia has been incredibly well served over the past couple of decades by what I call the economic umpires in our society, of which the ACCC is a prime example. But other examples are APRA, the Reserve Bank, and there's perhaps half a dozen of them that are critical to the structure of our society and how it functions, and a well-oiled economy and arm's length decision making about critical issues for business and working people being made by high calibre people who are genuinely independent of government and seek to do a good job and to comply with statutes. And the ACCC, both under Allan Fels and under Graham Samuel, has been an outstanding example of that. So for those of you who are members of that oppressed minority of reformers, I think it's something to bear in mind that a lot of great things have been achieved in our country over recent decades, including things that we often take for granted. And the role of institutions like the ACCC and the Reserve Bank and APRA and ASIC and so forth is one of those things that I think we perhaps should take note of. Now, it's an interesting task to be asked to talk about making reform happen in the middle of an election campaign where you've got commentators suggesting that the age of reform is over. And of course, we had some extraordinary events over the past few months that have very much punctuated what perhaps otherwise would have been a steady period of progress in Australia. I've been very heavily involved in reform efforts over the past 3 years, and indeed indirectly as a shadow minister for a much longer period. Shadow ministers have a bigger influence than you might think, because merely by defining the theatre of political combat, shadow ministers and oppositions play quite a significant role in our system. So what they choose to oppose the government on, and what messages they choose to put, and whether they choose to be creative or simplistic and small target, very much does define how Australian politics unfolds. And you can see an example of that only over the last couple of days with the issue of broadband, which I'll get to in a minute. But I've been involved as a minister in a whole range of reform efforts, but unfortunately some of them I think perhaps could be described as being too arcane and obscure even for this audience, much less the general public. So much as I'd love to give you an outline of how I and some extremely capable people in the Department of Finance and Deregulation have set about reforming federal government procurement, I suspect that you are here to get some slightly more exciting fare, even though we have collectively saved the Australian taxpayer literally hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and we are only part the way through this program of reform. By definition, it is pretty obscure stuff. So I'll leave that aside and concentrate on perhaps the two things that have been most prominent in the efforts that I've been directly involved in, namely the COAG process of harmonising and reforming regulation across Australia through the Business Regulation and Competition Working Group of COAG, which I co-chair with Craig Emerson, and secondly, the National Broadband Network, because in very different ways, these do provide some important lessons, I think, for people who are interested in economic reform, who are interested in working out how to make things happen, rather than the dominant dynamic of modern politics, which is how to look like you're making things happen without actually doing it. Now, the competition and business regulation reform agenda that was set in train by Kevin Rudd in December 2007, and of course all of the state and territory premiers and chief ministers, focused on one primary objective, and that is harmonisation of regulatory regimes across a very, very diverse range of regulatory frameworks across all of the states and territories. Some of them very broad and far-reaching, others very specific, very narrow, very much focused on particular sectors or particular activities. 27 items, a number of which had previously been put on the agenda at COAG. Now this of course has a special meaning. Being put on the agenda kind of means something a bit different from what you would normally think it means. Put on the agenda means that somebody actually wrote it down. It doesn't mean that it implies that anything might happen or that anybody might actually do anything after they leave the meeting, but putting it on the agenda sounds like you're doing something, and it means that everybody can run back to their respective constituencies and tell them that, yes, it's on the COAG agenda. And if anybody is so rude as to inquire what on the COAG agenda actually means, usually they aren't, but if they are, well then there's a bit of gobbledygook that you can resort to which confuses them so much that they give up. Now, so that's what we inherited, this kind of stuff, with things like hotspots and all this kind of thing, where actually nothing was happening. So we have a list of 27 items, and they include things of the following nature: occupational health and safety legislation, trade licensing, so licensing of plumbers and electricians and so forth, personal properties security registration. Now, I didn't know what personal property security was until I became Minister for Deregulation. What it is, and there's probably one or two people in the room who don't still know what it is, but I won't ask you to put your hands up and admit it. Personal property securities, of course, are in effect the mortgage that a financier holds over your car or your boat or whatever if you are purchasing an item of that kind and it's being financed by somebody else. They, in effect, have a hold over that that is equivalent to a mortgage that your bank has over your house. And it needs to be registered so that anybody who's prospectively buying your car or your boat off you knows what they're getting. Other examples include environmental assessment processes, the building codes that apply around the country, rail safety laws, heavy transport laws, laws governing food labelling, laws governing chemicals and plastics, and so the list goes on. Financial services, a range of areas that had not been made national, for example, regulation of trust companies and margin lending. So a very long list of things that in aggregate covers a pretty substantial proportion of total economic activity across Australia. And when you looked at each of these, what you found is a patchwork of regulatory regimes and arrangements across the country, sometimes contradictory, sometimes creating situations where, for example, in the food labelling area, it was physically impossible for a company to produce a product that complied with regulations all around the country, because to be compliant in South Australia, for example, automatically made it non-compliant in Victoria and vice versa. End result, if you want to sell your product, you've got to produce different versions or different labels in different jurisdictions. It's been a very interesting journey in this process, because we have spent the last 2.5 years in this working group that is populated by senior officials of state treasury and finance departments, but with the co-chairing of two politicians, Craig Emerson and myself. And we have slowly, methodically worked through all of these and bit by bit inched the agenda forward. And much to my amazement, it is still broadly on track. At the outset, I privately said to Craig Emerson that if we ended up with 20 or so in the bag at the end of the process, we would have done well. Well, amazingly enough, all 27 are still roughly on track. There's been the odd little bit of slippage here and there. There's been the odd hiccup. Every now and then, a state election occurs and there's a bit of a delay in a process that's necessarily going to occur. But in overview, the total process is still on track. Now, there's another couple of years still to go. Why? Because if you think about it, what's required in this process is first to reach in principle agreement about what is going to occur. And that could be a single national scheme. It could be a template piece of legislation in an individual state that other states and territories agree to implement by reference so that you get an identical regime across the country. It could be mutual recognition. It could be harmonisation. So there's a variety of possibilities. And once you've got agreement in principle, which often involves line agencies and line ministers as well as central agencies, then of course